Former Pistons beat writer Vince Goodwill joined the Bally Sports pre-game show yesterday in the Mavs game and had some very interesting thoughts on the Pistons' upcoming offseason, which we'll dive into in just a moment.
Lane, skies a jam. Dynamite dunk and the crowd loves it.
Back to Pistons Intellect. I'm your host, Jack Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Jack_Kelly_313. And before we get into today's show, as always, if you're feeling so kind, please hit that subscribe button. We're about 10 subscribers away from 1K, which I would love to hit as the final buzzer sounds on the season tomorrow in San Antonio. So appreciate all the love, as usual, all the comments, everything. So if you haven't subscribed yet, I would appreciate it a ton in the next 24 hours. So, as I just mentioned off the top, the Pistons played in Dallas yesterday. They actually won the game. It was pretty much a game of the Pistons they had Jaden Ivey playing Marcus Sasser, and then a ton of the same guys we've seen the past 2 weeks. And then the Mavs were without Luka, without Kyrie, and some other players. So it was a typical April NBA game where each team was just putting out their reserves and fringe players. So look, nice to them get a win. Marcus Sasser probably been the bright spot the past 2 games. He's had back-to-back 20-point games, and especially yesterday, he had a really strong second half and was a major reason for the Pistons winning. But I'm not here to talk about the game. The most interesting thing I took out of yesterday was former Pistons beat writer from the Detroit News, Vince Goodwill, and he currently writes for Yahoo as a sort of national media member. And I should also mention he co-hosts the Detroit Players podcast with James Edwards III of The Athletic. So I think he's a Detroit native, at least from Michigan. So he knows a lot about the Pistons, and clearly he worked on the beat for 8 years, between 2007 and 2015. So he joined the pregame show with Mickey York and I believe Grant Long, and he had some interesting comments. There's a 5-minute clip on Twitter that Bally put out, which I'll put in the comments, but I kind of just found his thoughts interesting. And with, the Pistons' last game tomorrow or today, by the time you're watching this in San Antonio, I think his thoughts were interesting. So the first thing they sort of discussed or asked Vinny about was the coaching of the Pistons this season and sort of Monty Williams' future in Detroit. And there's a couple of things I took from his response. And first of all, Vinny cited that Monty has a long leash. So a lot of that's tied around his contract and how long he still has, I think, 4 years with the Pistons, and around he has a ton of money owed to him. I think from memory, he's on like 9 to 10 million a season. So he's still got a lot of money owed to him across the next 3 to 4 years. So, Vinny cited that he thinks, and if it was him, and I assume he's kind of putting together this summary, he said he expects the organization to kind of go to Monty and ask him how invested is he long-term with Detroit? Does he have the stomach for a rebuild? Or is this a case of dramatically overhauling the roster? He used the words performing such surgery on the roster that it can compete quicker. And I'll touch on kind of more about that in the last segment about how will the roster look. But I think it's really interesting because James Edwards III has floated out the idea that Monty is not safe by any means in a couple of his articles. He doesn't say that James didn't allude to the fact that he thinks Monty's getting fired, but he kind of wrote that he wouldn't be surprised if Monty was to go and Troy was to stay. And it's super interesting because it's such a weird dynamic, because obviously Monty, the push in the offseason, that was a Tom Gore's decision. Troy Weaver was set on Charles Lee or oh my God, I can't remember the other young coach, but Troy was looking more for like a young coach to grow with the team, and then Tom Gore swooped in and threw the bag at Monty, and the rest is history. So it's really interesting because you have a front office which has failed, but then they also didn't get to select this coach. So, does Tom Gores have some buyer's remorse and kind of say, well, okay, I'll take the blame and get rid of Monty, and I don't mind paying that contract out, or because there is so much money owing, and Gore's made that decision, and Monty, he's been really bad this season. But I mean, I'm a big believer that your team is as good. The number one thing that will make your team good, and the number one thing that should always be looked at, is the roster, because the players, I think the blame coaches get is often like overblown. I think yes, Monty's made some major mistakes this season, and if he's fired, I'm cool with that, because I think he's done some things which make no sense. But it's the players are number one, and the roster has been constructed so poorly. But it's just going to be super interesting, because part of me thinks Tom Gores might just say, my bad. And this kind of brings me to the front office stuff. My bad. I shouldn't have swooped in and I'm going to give, Troy a bit of grace here because he didn't get his man as a coach. But then part of me thinks maybe Tom Gores just eats the money and says we need a new coach. So it's interesting. The coaching thing, you could tell me Monty's fired, and you could tell me he's here for another 2 years, and I wouldn't know which one. Both scenarios are likely to me. It's like 50-50. So I think the next part, though, is on the front office, and Vinny was asked once again, what do you think is going to happen with the front office? Does any change need to be there? Really alluded to, there's more of a story with the front office than the coaching. And, they are the one I've spoken about this, and a lot of people, the front office are the one constant that have been here the 4 years. That's why I feel I think no matter what, the front office needs to change. Absolutely. If I rank the three things, and I've spoken about this, it goes front office, roster, coaching for me, in that order. All three need huge change. But if you have to rank it, that's for me, because the front office has been here for 4 years, and you cannot lose this amount of games and then just say, oh, it's the coach. Oh, it's, it's the players, not the they are the one constant that have been here the entire time. So it's that needs change. And I didn't actually know this, but the Pistons, and James Edwards III also spoke about this, and I believe even it was reported by Woj or Shams that the Pistons are going to look for a president of basketball operations, something they haven't had since Stan Van Gundy was fired in 2018. So Vinny also said they're going to search that basketball ops person, and that person will ultimately have decisions on coaching and the roster. So for me as well, it's all super interesting, because now you're going to bring in some new leadership. And this is kind of where the thing about Tom Gores potentially having some buyer's remorse with the coach and keeping Troy around. I could see that although I think if you're not going to keep Troy as a GM, he should just be gone, because he should just clean house. I don't understand. I know he's done some good stuff drafting wise, but I just think you need new, fresh ideas, everything. So, if the Pistons do bring in, if the plan is to bring in a new head of basketball operations, then I don't think the following day after the Spurs game on April 15th, I feel like maybe we don't get the notification that Monty Williams has been fired. We don't get the notification that Troy Weaver's been fired. Maybe the Pistons are going to make priority one, get a new president of basketball operations, and then allow them to make the decisions on Troy, allow them to make the decisions on the coaching, allow them to make decisions on the roster. And I think part of me is, I think that would make a ton of sense, because what has been the main thing that is so frustrating with this organization is it feels like there's too many cooks in the kitchen. And I know in other organizations, that kind of thing, it's never ever that just the GM has one thought and it's always what the GM does. Obviously there's plenty of minds that they trust to help make these decisions, but it feels the coaching thing, even with the Dwayne Casey thing, feels like Tom Gores has always had a tendency to go try and get the big fish established coach that might have already ran the course, and he did that with Monty and overrode his front office in that sense. So If I kind of had to guess what happens with the coach and front office a day after reading about what James has to say in the Athletic, after listening to what Vince Goodwill had to say yesterday, to me, it feels like that Monty. I'm not saying he won't be fired, but I feel like he will. He's not going to be fired the next day after the season. I really just don't think that's the case. I think Monty has a like Vinny says, he has a long leash. I feel like the decision on Monty is a lot tougher than a decision on Troy Weaver. And I feel like I fully believe that Troy Weaver will either be fired the day after, or it's more likely that he is they part ways because maybe Troy doesn't want that reduced role, or he's put into like head of scouting or something like that, and that the Pistons will officially launch a search for a head of basketball operations. And then the Monty thing, I think a decision will be made on that once that head of basketball operations is found. That's my gut feel. It could be completely wrong, but that's what my gut feel. What happens in kind of the immediate days after the season? I still think a new head of basketball ops might come in and say, "No, we're not. Monty isn't the guy, and we are not overhauling this roster for some short-term success and trading all that." Like maybe the head of basketball sees something in the core four and might still move on from, say, Jaden Ivey, but they might still want to go, "No, we need another season of consolidating this youth, getting better veterans, but we are not ready to just trade everything out and try bring in 30-year-olds to surround Cade to kind of get this thing trending in a quicker direction." But maybe they do come in and say, "No, we're going to move these young pieces. I don't see them working with Cade." But I think once that basketball ops person comes in and can figure out how this team is going to move forward, because it feels like it just needs a full reset in terms of the direction, because it's become directionless and rudderless in many ways. Like the team has no identity. There's no defensive identity. Offensively, they're horrible. They don't have shooting. They kind of fixed it at the trade deadline, but really, there's no direction with this team. They're just that's kind of what has been the most negative and scary thing, is like all we have as fans is hope, because like there's no defensive identity. You don't see it. Like the two bigs thing didn't work at all. Like, and then offensively, there's so much inconsistency and struggles, and so once that person's elected, they get a feel for how they want to run this team, how they want to build it around Cade. I think then that's where we get decision on Monty, because I don't think it's a decision where you're just going to fire him the next day because of the money you owe him and because you still don't know the direction that you want to go with this team. So if you're bringing new leadership, you want that leadership to be aligned with your coach. So you don't want to fire Monty and then bring in someone else, pay Monty all this money, and then you fired him, but then your potential person you want to come in wants a guy like Monty. So I think if they're hiring a basketball ops guy, I think Troy is still very vulnerable to go, but I think Monty will be hanging around, and it'll be interesting to see what happens with him. The final thing Vinny kind of spoke about was how the roster will look next season, and this one wasn't too much of a surprise, but Vinny suggested that to expect dramatic overhaul. He kind of said, aside from Cade and Asar and maybe Fontecchio in free agency, like everyone else, it kind of feels like is on the table, which that wasn't too surprising. That doesn't mean Jaden Ivey, Jalen Duren are like 100% being traded. It just means like the Pistons are going to listen to offers on absolutely everyone, which makes sense. They should. They absolutely should. And he cited just the need for the Pistons to add vets, which I spoke about in the last video, and that's been an issue the whole season. The Pistons have not had any vets or any established players who can play some defense and help Cade offensively. They just haven't had any until Fontecchio, who's, he's as old as a veteran, but he's only this is only his second season in the NBA. So the final thing he kind of suggested, they asked him who do they think, if the Pistons land the number 1 overall pick this draft, who does they think Vinny will take? And Vinny said the number 1 pick will be traded. So that also doesn't surprise me. I would be, if the Pistons get a top 2, top 3 pick and they select a player, I think I'll be okay with that. But I will, if they select a player in this draft, I would expect that, that's because Ivy and Durant are gone and they've been moved for some vets, all that kind of thing, because I just don't think you can bring back those four, draft another 19, 20-year-old and think this is going to work, because that's what they did this season and it was a disaster. So the Pistons are limited kind of with assets because of that pick they owe to the Knicks. So they can trade this season's pick, and I believe like the 2028 future pick has just become available. But I don't think you want to go moving future picks. I think you could move this one because the draft's weak and you're not getting a star. Like there will be inevitably a star, but the chances in this draft are even lower. And so I'm cool if they trade the pick if it gets them back a player that's going to help win next season, or at least help Cade Cunningham continue to evolve and become into that number one option I think he'll be. So just some interesting insights. Like I said, I'll link the video. It was a 5-minute video. I just thought it was really interesting. And honestly, it was having him on that pregame show, I thought was awesome. You could kind of tell Grant Long and Mickey York were a bit shook with some of his responses because Vince was just so direct and honest. And I feel like for a lot of the time on the Bally Sports broadcast, sometimes I feel sorry for those guys, but sometimes I feel like they try to just be too positive and not really have many honest conversations about the team because, I get they've got to be positive, but I also think that like in a season like this, you can be more critical on a consistent basis. So it was cool to hear Vinny come in and just inject some life and some humor, but also just have some really good insight. So let me know what you think is going to happen. As I said, I'll wrap it up now. I think that I'm just going to put following the few days after the Spurs game tomorrow, I feel like we definitely hear something on Troy Weaver, whether that's him being fired or whether that's him being resigned to a lesser role within the organization. And I also think that the Pistons will launch an official search for a new head of basketball ops, and that we'll get a decision on Monty once that person's selected. Because as we heard the other day, Monty isn't going to take a buyout. Doesn't sound like he's going to stand down or leave off his own bat. And to be honest, if I was him, I wouldn't either. He signed for all that money. Like, get your money. I don't. If I was him, I would not be walking away from that money. So, yeah, go watch that little clip if you want some Pistons content. Pistons have one more game tomorrow against the Spurs. I will do a final video to recap that, although Victor Wembanyama is being listed as out. Cade's doubtful. Jalen Duran's questionable. Probably going to be another game where there's nothing to take from it. But it's the last game of the season. It's the last time we'll see the Pistons on an NBA court in 6 months. So I'll watch it back and we'll break it down a little bit, and we might even have some news. We'll see. We'll see what happens. But yeah, let me know your thoughts, what's going to happen. But until tomorrow, as always, go.
Sky's a jam. Dynamite dunk in the crowd.